Take heart, my friend, we'll go together this uncertain road that lies ahead, our faithful God.
Welcome to Take Heart, where we are exploring current human experiences that display or call for biblical truth. Today I have with me a dear friend of mine for over 30 years, Dr. Jim Reitman. Jim has written this book, Unlocking Wisdom, which I highly recommend. You may want to have a dictionary next to you when you read it. And then also this one, he co-authored Portraits of Righteousness that I also recommend. Jim has gone through so much and quite a story that I know because we've known each other for a long time.
Yeah.
So I'd like for you to share your story, your spiritual journey, your relational journey, and then we'll get into other things that you and I have talked about before. So I'd like to hear your story, Jim.
Well, Ruben's right. We've known each other for a long time, and he played a very important role in my spiritual development not too long after I came to know the Lord.
And you were not born in a Christian home.
That's right. My father was born Jewish. He never practiced his faith. My mother was born in a Lutheran family, and she never practiced her faith. And to my knowledge, neither of them ever accepted the Lord before they passed away. My father was a physician, an anesthesiologist, and was very focused on intellectual development and proficiency. So the people who could think well and articulate well impressed him, and he impressed that upon me. Being the oldest of four children, I learned my lesson all too well. So I grew up essentially a straight A student, looking for performance in academics as my mark of success and mark of personal achievement and personal development.
So his Jewishness never came up to you?
Never came up.
No temples, no synagogue?
Well, thanks for mentioning that, because there was a couple of times that my father got a little bit more transparent. He was not a particularly transparent person, but he did on a couple of occasions recall his experience as a medic in World War II. He was involved in the second wave of the Normandy invasion, so a little bit after D-Day when he came in. And he remembered interviewing people in his experience having gone in toward the end of the war. And there were a few incidents that really piqued impressed him at the level of the soul as opposed to the intellect. One of them was a Christmas Eve service where French and German soldiers who were absolutely mortal enemies at this time toward the end of the war, on Christmas Eve came together and sang Christmas carols together in some abandoned barn. I don't remember all the details, but my father would tell this story almost with tears in his eyes, where he was not that emotional a man, except for his anger. He was very, very angry man when things didn't go his way. And so that kind of impressed me. The other thing the story that he tells is that when he was in third grade, he was invited to take place in the Christmas play. So Christmas plays a big role for some reason in his growth and development. And because he was a little Jewish boy, he was not allowed to play any part other than some non-speaking part, like a shepherd or something like that, and he was not. He really wanted to get into the main
Story.
the storyline. And when he went into practice in Laredo, Texas, where I was born and raised, he developed very close relationships with Catholic nuns who played a really important role in the hospital. It was Mercy Hospital, Laredo, Texas, which was run by nuns.
Now, if I'm correctly, those stories of the war and Christmas there in Laredo place, this is something that he shared with you.
Yeah, he shared voluntarily. In fact, when I was in McAllen the first time around, back in the mid-'80s, our music minister would put on a Christmas pageant every Christmas. And one of those years, I was asked to give my own story of Christmas, and I used that example of my father's, and it was very moving. So, yeah, there's just something about that touched him at the soul level that never really got to where it needed to go. My own children, once they came to know the Lord at the ages of like 5 and 7, actually tried to evangelize Grandma and Grandpa. Wow. And my mother in particular was just extremely bitter about that. Don't talk to me about that. I don't want you to talk about that, and that sort of thing. So
there was something there from the past that blocked.
Definitely.
Yeah. So you grew up no religious influence. At what point did you like? What happened?
This is interesting because my father and mother decided that they wanted us to be to make our own decisions in life about religion or spirituality, and they never even used those words. But when I was in probably 10 or 11. I was the oldest of 4. He would take all 4 of us to the Methodist church in town, First Methodist Church of Laredo, Texas. And they would just leave us there. They never came to church, never spent, 1 second, except during my baptism at the age of 13. They came to see that. And so the idea was, my father told me later on that the reason they took me to First Methodist Church was it was the most vanilla flavored, non-committal kind of. He even could tell that just as an unbeliever, knew that there were more conservative and dyed-in-the-wool religious fanatic types of denominations, but the Methodist Church was the one that was more user-friendly to people who, just were searching or shopping for a religious experience.
Wow. So at that church is where you became? You got
no.
the gospel?
Oh, no.
You were baptized there?
I was baptized, but I'll tell you, I can remember as I was there, of course, they only sprinkle. So I remember the pastor reciting this line about, you've come to know the Lord Jesus Christ, blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, and half my brain was saying, I don't believe that. Oh, okay, well, I'll just go through the motions, And I remember telling myself that because I wanted to be intellectually honest with myself, but I felt like I was a part of the youth group, which was called MYF, Methodist Youth Fellowship. So, in fact, I was the song leader of our group in junior high when I was in MYF. So I knew and had memorized the harmony of a bunch of songs, hymns, basic fundamental hymns of the faith. And I could sing them with the best of them because I was the song leader.
So what I'm hearing is that at that point, the biggest influence was these relationships that you liked, and then the music. Right.
I had girlfriends that I went with for a while out of MYF, and it just, I enjoyed the fellowship. I really, really enjoyed the relationships that I had, at least at that level of junior high. So
interesting. And the rest, interesting because that's kind of my story as well. When I started going to church, after I had left the church, and then I went back, I wasn't impressed with anything
Yeah.
other than the people were
Right.
genuine.
Yeah.
And there was something like, huh. So I was asked to go again, and this time I didn't resist. I went, but it was, and I couldn't articulate at the moment. Only years later,
Yeah.
I wait a minute, that's what kept me going back, is those good relationships, loving relationships. And they showed a genuine care in me as a person. Nothing that stuck with me religiously. It was later. But that's what I'm hearing from you, that you had those relationships
Well,
and the music.
Yeah, and getting back to the intellectual honesty issue, which was really a recurring thing for me, the people who had kind of been there for a few years would be allowed to give the lesson after a while. And we had sponsors, that would, adults that would be in the group. But I can remember giving a lesson that was based on an essay by an atheist. And, it really impressed me intellectually what this guy was doing on the basis of just a logical reasoning of essentially science being our God, and that's what we should really push, because that's the only thing that's really reliable and testable and that sort of thing. So even at the age of 13 or 14, I was out there in your face, and I can remember sticking to my guns when people tried to, especially the adult leaders were like, "Are you sure you know what you're doing here?" And because I could express myself well, I told them beyond a shadow of a doubt, yes, I'm absolutely into this, and I think they need to know this too. So this kind of thing. Yeah.
Wow. So then from there, what happened that you eventually heard the gospel somehow?
Yeah. So it was years and years at that point. I went to school, continued to be, invested in academic performance as a marker, as an indicator of my success or ability, value, meaning in life, whatever you want to call it. And so grades were everything. I eventually went away to school, to military academy as a junior in high school. And so there was another level of performance there, with the military background. And so I graduated basically pretty high in the class rank out of some 190 or so graduating class. I was like 7th, I think, out of 190, and went away to college and discovered girls, and but still was very, very committed to academic success and performance, and did very well academically, and had relationships with people that were much more demonstrative at the emotional level, let's put it that way. And I can remember gravitating to people that just weren't like me like that. And I also really went into sports in a big way. So I was the captain of the track team and into performance in track, and really polished that to a fine art to the extent that I was able physically. And that part of it has continued. I still am very, very invested in physical health as a pursuit of exercise in particular. So I'm into cycling now because my hips just started to deteriorate years ago because of all that high impact exercise. And my father had hip arthritis as well, even though he wasn't particularly athletic. So
if I remember correctly, I remember this story. You had turned 40 and you had an X-ray, and the doctor told you, "Jim, you've got hips of a 50-year-old, 60-year-old."
Right. Yes, that's true. Yeah, one of the orthopedists here in the valley took X-rays, and the reason that they took the X-rays was that I joined the Air Force. So that's the next, and that was 1990. And that was the year I left the Valley. And so I had to go through a physical as part of my induction into the Air Force as an officer, a medical officer. So I had back issues because when I was in seminary,
This was Dallas Seminary.
Dallas Seminary. In 1982, roughly, I had helped some guys lift a car that had turned over in a ditch and herniated my disc. And so I had to put that on my application as a physical issue. So they took just a plain X-ray of the lumbar spine, looking to see if the spine was okay. And he said, "Your spine looks fine, but your hips are older than you are." So that was that story there. So I had already come to know the Lord at that point.
How did that happen? I'm interested.
So backing up from the hip X-ray, I continued through college at Pomona College in Claremont, California, as a pre-med, and I was accepted to the University of Chicago and did my first 2 years there, and then transferred to Washington University in St. Louis because there was a researcher there in the Department of Physiology who was doing research on exercise physiology. So I was still really interested in the biochemistry and the physiology of exercise, and so I spent a lot of time researching and published a number of papers on exercise for several years after that experience in medical school on into my post-graduate experience. So as part of that research, I ended up applying to the NIH for my third year of internal medicine residency. I was accepted there, and our job is second-year residency level of training was to take care of all the research patients on the ward at the National Institutes of Health. And the part of that I was involved in was the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. So we took care of patients that they were doing studies on there. And it was during my first year at the NIH, where I was doing research, that my wife started going to a local evangelical church, and it was a startup by a pastor who had gone to Biola University, and I think had done 1 year in seminary and then just dropped out. He just didn't want any more academics. He was like the opposite end of the spectrum of me. Is like, I want the best degree I can get when I went to seminary. But this guy he wanted to hit the ground running and was a people person. And my wife started going to this church. It was called Montgomery Community Church in Montgomery County, right there in Rockville, Maryland, where we were living as a bedroom community for the National Institutes of Health. And she went to the Safeway store there in Rockville to do our shopping. We're in a condominium that we lived in, and ran into a grocery checkout guy, this black fellow named Larry Butler, I think was his name. And he was going to Washington Bible College, I think, in D.C., and evangelized her where she went through the line. Now, she says she came to believe in the Lord as a child, but had not practiced the faith. In fact, she was a Mormon when I met her the year before. And so he gave her the 4 spiritual laws as she was going through the grocery checkout line. And so she started going to his church, which was this Montgomery County Community Church. And the thing that impressed me about that experience was I was still into track. And, on Sundays, I would go across the river to, I guess it was Arlington, Virginia, on the other side of Rock. I'd go from Rockville to Virginia for a track meet on Sunday morning. So I wasn't going to the church with her. And I noticed a difference in her ability to basically have patience with me, because I was a tough buzzard as a husband.
You were a terror, if I remember.
Yeah, you tell that story later. But the pastor, this people person, Clem Walshauser was his name. He just died a year ago, by the way. I found out from someone else at MCC, the church I eventually went to, that he had died. And he started working on my wife and said, Peggy, how do you think we're going to get to your husband? You know, and he just invested. He just decided, I'm going to invest in this tough nut to crack. And I can remember my wife telling him, well, I guess you can try, but he's just going to chew you up and spit you out. And because of that intellectual,
Right,
you know, and
right.
I was in college, I had actually run into some Christians and basically was into evolution and mocking. I would just mock these people giving me the 4 spiritual laws, and, you know, how can you talk about creation and, you know, the humanity without bringing in evolution? Of course, we evolved from lower life forms, and almost, in fact, I overtly mocked Christians at that time in college. So Peggy knew that. She wasn't with me but I had told her stories about that. And so he said, well, does he like sports? And she said, oh, yeah, he's really into sports. You think he'd like to join the softball team? So they had a church softball team. So I went to the softball thing a year after we got married, and my first son had just been born. So I joined the softball team, and I didn't know anybody, and I didn't even know the pastor. She just said, would you like to go play softball? And that's all she said. And I said, sure, I'd love to. And so the guy that was the most into the game, you know, sliding into second base and, you know, bumping into people and knocking people off the base and just really into it, was the pastor. And I said, who is that guy that really is like into it? You know, oh, that's the pastor. I said, no, you're kidding me. So that intrigued me, and because he was into the sports and really into it. And so he asked if this was the end of the season, and that fall, it was a summer league. Could I meet with you, you know, on Thursday night? I have Thursday nights open. I said, sure. So he gave me the gospel, and it was the tried and true 4 spiritual laws, Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and he asked me to read more Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the second edition. And I can remember going through that from a scientific point of view. And so the thing that got me, the thing that hooked me intellectually, not at the heart level, was statistics. Josh McDowell cited all of these people. He had these little manuals that he put together where he would put in there extensive quotes from these people who were previously atheists, but had, you know, tried to disprove Christianity in their particular area of expertise, their particular academic area. And so one of them was a mathematician who had asked himself the question, what would the probability be of these, say, 30 prophecies in the Old Testament that were clearly messianic prophecies, all becoming true in one person by accident? And it was like 10 to the 40 zeros power, 1 over 10 to the 40 zeros power of probability that, and I'm going, oh, well, that's just statistical impossibility. There's no way that could be possibly ever, you know, fulfilled in one person just by accident. And so, you know, you have the former atheist talking about monkeys on typewriters, you know, and typing out, you know, the gospel or whatever, the Bible, how many monkeys it would take and how many years of so many monkeys typing, is that kind of argument. And that really did impress me, just from a strictly statistical, scientific point of view. So intellectually,
Intrigued you.
He hooked me just using the Josh McDowell kind of approach to evangelism. So I can remember after about the third meeting, he looked at me. He knew that just from our conversation that had impressed me. He said, is there anything, Jim, keeping you from trusting the Lord, trusting Jesus Christ as your Savior? And I said, yeah. And he said, really? Well, I thought you believed that Jesus was who he said he was, and that he died and was resurrected and all these things. And I said, yeah. So why aren't you accepting him as your Lord and Savior? And I said, I'll show you. And I took his pamphlet of the Four Spiritual Laws, and there was the big chasm where the cross bridges the chasm.
Right.
And that one, it wasn't as impressive to me as the one with the chair. So when this particular tract had a picture of a chair, and it had S on the chair for self and C on the chair for Christ. And so when you go across the bridge of the cross and you go to the other side and God accepts you into heaven, then, you take the S off and put the C on the chair, which is basically an image of lordship. And so my convictions now, in retrospect, are free grace, which is that you can accept Christ as your Savior without making him your Lord. And you and I both run into people all the time who are not submitted to the Lordship of the Lord. Well, here was my thing. I didn't want no one on my chair except me, And I said, so it didn't matter. I knew that if I was going to be intellectually honest, I was going to have to make him Lord of my life, and I didn't want any part of it. Okay? So he said...
That takes a lot of honesty for most people to say, no, I don't want
exactly. But
God may be God, but I'm God.
And God makes us all so different, and that's just me. I mean, I'm like, in your face, I'm going to tell the truth no matter what. So he said, what would happen if you die tonight? I'd probably go to hell. and his eyes got big. He said, I have nothing else to say, because if he's not afraid of hell, the old fire insurance technique, then what else can I argue? He says, okay, all right, we're done. But I knew that there was the relational part, and this gets back to the sort of topic of our discussion today, at least the first part of it, and that is, I knew in my heart, as I started thinking about my role as father and husband, because I was so into performance and my research. By this point, I was through with that first year where we took care of the patients, and I was into my second year where I was actually doing my own research, and I finally can, hit the ground running here and, make a star of myself in the area of scientific research and publish articles and be seen as a real force to be reckoned with, And that was very important to me. So, but I knew in the back of my mind, in my conscience, this is where stuff started to trickle down from the brain to the heart.
There you go.
Okay?
There you go. Because in essence, your soul was starving. I mean, you didn't have much personal relationship with your dad. It was intellectual.
Right.
Your mom, same thing.
Yes.
And here you were, without knowing it, you were starving.
Well, and that goes back to NYF when I was a kid, and those relationships were important to me, even though I was giving a lesson from an atheist essayist, out of this book of atheist essays. And that was important to me, but it was more important now that I was responsible as a human being for my wife and my relationship with my wife, and perhaps even more so for my children. But I was more thinking about, both really important, because I had just had a son, and he was, by this point, 3 months old, 4 months old.
Isn't that amazing how a newborn can just touch you so profoundly?
So here's what did it. Here was the leverage that got me to at least start to come to church. So it was the fall, and this track season was over, and I wasn't going to Virginia anymore to run in the track meet on Sunday morning. So I decided I'd go with my wife and come to Sunday school. So the first time I got there, this guy was preaching on head covering from 1 Corinthians 11.
Oh, my goodness.
That was the first sermon, at least in this setting. I mean, I'd gone to sermons in the Methodist Church.
You're supposed to submit under authority.
And so his wife was the piano player. We were meeting in an elementary school gymnasium, of all things. And he was preaching on head covering and had convinced his wife to put a doily on her head as she played the piano. And that to me was just absurd. And I stood up in the middle of his sermon, this unbeliever in the midst of these people, and I said, do we have to emphasize the trivial points here? Why don't we just major on the important stuff, And he stopped his sermon and gave me his undivided attention, and I don't even remember his answer. All I remember is his patience with me. and my wife trying to dig a 6-foot grave to get out of anybody's sight. I don't know this guy. Don't blame him on me. That's all on him. So that started a relationship with the pastor where he totally invested in me, and he started going to the NIH every Tuesday noon. And I would come out of the NIH during my noon break, sit in his car, and he would work through two books, Know What You Believe and Know Why You Believe. And I forget the name of the author, but I'm sure the guy's long dead. But those two were very popular books at the time on just basic doctrinal survey, and then Know Why You Believe. And I don't even remember much of the content, but I do remember meeting with Clem and how
his care, his love for
his investment is the word I would use. Yes, absolutely. And so that spring I got baptized, and it was, I never even could, back then they were saying, write the time and the date in your Bible on the flyleaf that you trusted the Lord as your, as your Savior. And I never did that. I just knew it was an intellectual admission of defeat, that I could not be a good father or a good husband, and I needed outside intervention, namely the power of God through Christ.
That was the beginning of breaking your self-sufficiency.
Yes, right, the beginning. And we're still working on that, okay? So how many years later? That was 1988. So, no, it was 19...
It might have been surely before that.
No,
78
that's
maybe.
right. No, it was I was 28 years old. So that was in 1978. There you go, 1978. So I went in with my, shorts and T-shirt and climbed into this corrugated, galvanized bathtub, thing like you see in the old westerns, where they and he dunked me in cold water, and I came up, and I had a grin on my face that just went for a mile.
Wow.
I knew that I was in the family, and I had no doubt about it. I have never once doubted my salvation, not for a microsecond, since I came out of the water in 1978.
How about that? Wow. And so then from there, things began to change for you. And my question right now is, because you've done a lot of work with the Bible.
Yes.
At that point, what was your relationship with the Bible? Like, you became super interested in it, or it was just more like
hear
the sermons?
Here's how that happened. Going back to childhood, my father being an anesthesiologist with the medical background and the sort of science behind that, and all being what you would normally think should be a person's aptitude if they want to go into medicine, that was not what floated my boat. My heart was never like inspired by being a doctor or even by science, except insofar as it tested your intellectual capacity, your ability. From the time I was probably in 7th grade, I knew that I was interested in words and their meaning and the ability of words to move people at the emotional level, as unemotional as I came off.
Wow.
I loved poetry. I wrote poetry.
Really?
I got into it.
So this drive, because you became a doctor on internal medicine to boot.
Yes, of all things.
So it wasn't that was. So my only conclusion is, like, you wanted to impress your dad somehow, because what else would have?
If I try to go my subjective kind of awareness of what was going on inside of me, it was just something to do to advance, beyond just my education, where academics was the way I measured my success or ability.
But words and even poetry was really,
there was something going on.
Moved you.
Yep.
Wow.
From a very 7th grade. I mean, we're talking pretty early in life. So I knew I could write. I got A's on all my poems and all. I mean, even expository writing, where you're supposed to just take a topic and develop it.
Interesting.
And, 3 paragraphs, introduction, development,
right.
conclusion. And I just instinctively, I did that. When I got to high school, the last 2 years in military academy, I took the advanced placement test in English and aced the sucker without even studying, trying, no effort at all, got a 5. That was the highest you could get. And I didn't have to take English in college because I got a 5 on the advanced placement. And I mean, that was just way outstripped the effort that I had to put into the science and the pre-med and all that kind of stuff in college. So later on, I was surprised when I got that score back because I didn't think it had been all that hard. I mean, you had to write these long essays. They gave you different books, so you could choose from a list of books that most people would read at some point in high school, and then write an evaluation of it or a précis, a summary of the argument of the novel. Usually, I think I did Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which is a pretty involved
book. Yeah,
I mean that's a heavy duty book.
Yeah,
and it was just like wiping the sweat off my forehead.
So that bubbled up when you became a Christian and got involved.
Yes. I started going to an evangelical church after we left Rockville. I did 2 more years of research in Phoenix, joined an evangelical church in Phoenix, and Ron Blue from Dental Seminary and Missions Department back then came down. And he was associated with Central American Mission, CAM International, and gave a talk to our church as just a guest pastor, and I said, I want that. I just want that, and so at that point, it was still intellectual, though. It wasn't a heart thing. It was still intellectual, because that's what floated my boat when I was in 7th grade and on up through high school, writing all my expository and poetry kinds of endeavors. And so there's just something about that excited me. And it involved the emotions, because I knew that to move people with what you write, you have to touch the emotions. And so I was able to do that. But it was almost like, I know what works, and so I'm going to write that into the as opposed to, man, it moved me. It didn't really.
I'm interested. What was it that Ron Blue said, or his presentation, that you said, I want that? Was he super intellectual, or what was it that?
Well, Ron Blue is not that intellect. I mean, he wasn't. That's not the way he came across. He came across as a very endearing and just a very human kind of individual in the World Missions Department there. And I don't remember what he preached on, but it moved me. And I knew, where does that guy come from, and so I had a choice, because the youth pastor at the time was from a Southern Baptist seminary, and I wrote to Dallas, and I told the dean of admissions, or maybe I even talked to Ron Blue. I can't remember now, and I said, I have this choice. I was thinking of going to the seminary where the youth pastor had graduated, or and the guy said, don't even think about the other alternative. Dallas is where you want to go, because I guess I came across that way of wanting all the tools and,
Right. I find it interesting that intellectually that's what you were most aware of, but what actually drove you was something that you were not as aware of. Right. Ron Blue touched you in such a way that, okay, that's what I want. But intellectually, that's what you were most aware of.
I have since, and much more recently, just within the last year or two, been reading a lot of Watchman Nee. And he uses different terms about the different components of how we're put together. Right. He talks about the outer man and the inner man, and then the soul kind of in between the outer man and the inner man. And I realized that you can't separate those cleanly.
Right.
They're all kind of mutually interacting, and as one goes, it has an inevitable influence on other parts.
There's a lot of mystery there,
makeup.
but yeah.
And as I look back on that, I think that's exactly what was going on. I just could not hermetically seal part of my soul, my makeup from the body or from, and of course
Right.
I was into track and I knew that I felt better and that there was more sense of well-being, with all of that intense physical training. And I was kind of addicted to it. So there was that
Sure.
part going on there that affects your soul, really. You're getting life from whatever it is.
That adrenaline, that dopamine in there that
And
can
the
excite you.
performance
Yeah.
at the physical level is different than intellectual. And so there was that aspect of it too that I became addicted to. And so there was that other aspect of performance that I was developing toward my latter years of education in college in particular. So there was that stirring there, both from the creative writing approach that taps into a more than just your intellect,
Right,
and then
right.
the physical activity and training and the they even call it the runner's high. I wasn't a long distance runner, but I was a sprinter and a hurdler, and there was something about that was really just, you got a high from that too. So you're right. There was something going on stirring in the soul at a very much earlier age than anything that had to do with what are you going to do with Jesus.
So, and when you got to Dallas Seminary, they're very intellectual and
Yes.
stimulating, and so it
Kid
was
in the
just
candy shop. Man, it's like, give me one of those. Give me one. I wanted to. I even went in to Zane Hodges' office and begged him to take his course on, I think it was Hebrews at the time. Hebrews or James, I can't remember. He was teaching one particular general epistle, and I hadn't had the original languages. In fact, I only got the Master's in Biblical Studies 2-year degree, and I wanted so much to take all these others in the candy shop that I had to leave the languages on the
because
shelf.
at that point you were already a medical doctor in an emergency room.
Right.
While you were going through
That's
seminary.
right. I was supporting us by doing 24-hour shifts in the ER in the weekend. So Zane was kind,
Zane Hodges.
but he said, no, you got to have the languages to take my course. There's just too much of the Greek. And in retrospect, I've since taken the languages, not at Dallas Seminary.
Right.
I went to Denver
Denver,
Seminary
yeah.
years and years later, and I got straight A's in all the Hebrew and the Greek. But as I look back, I think because I was so gifted in language and writing and the way words are put together to impact, and I knew Spanish, and I had taken Latin in high school, and Latin is very extensively declined language. It's much more inflected, it would be the technical term, both in the verbal and the nominal system. That would have put me right into Greek. In fact, it did when I took the Greek. Oh, I know this
Right.
stuff from Latin,
Right.
the ablative case, and they don't have ablative in Koine Greek, but I knew how it evolved. I was intuitively understanding all this stuff. So I think in retrospect, I probably could have taken Zane's course and I would have done just fine.
Just fine. Yeah. Wow. Because I remember seeing you in seminary, and all I remember about you, Jim, was that you were always in a hurry. You were always with your head up.
Man on a mission.
Where is he going? Where is he going? That fast. That's all I remember about you.
That's right. That is exactly, and I don't remember anybody from seminary.
Isn't that crazy?
To just add, insult to injury, I was not into relationships there at all, except at the church where I went. So,
What church were you in? At
Montgomery Community Church.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. No, that was before. The church in Dallas was Reinhardt.
Reinhardt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you graduated. You already had your second child?
No, that didn't come until we went down to the valley.
Oh, okay.
So Peggy
Okay.
had Katie down in the
Okay.
valley. Oh, wait a minute. No, I had Katie at seminary. That's right. She was at Baylor. She was born at Baylor University. So actually, I was so wanting to finish my class, they finally had to just drag me out to go because I got the message that she was in labor, Same thing happened with my first child, only I wasn't a believer then. So she remembers that. And to this day, she'll hold it against me if I've upset her.
Talk about
You're
determination.
just like you always were. You never even showed up for my, you know.
So you finished, and you were still this self-determined man.
Yeah.
You finished seminary, and then was it directly from Dallas that you moved down to the valley, the Rio Grande Valley?
Right. I interviewed with all these mission agencies, and because my wife had been divorced, no mission agency would accept me because my wife. So that's talk about secondary and tertiary separation there. That was pretty strict on most evangelical missions, but the one that did accept me was, at the time, it was called HCJB, Heralding Jesus Christ's Blessings is what that stood for. World Radio Missionary Fellowship, and then it got named even another name after that, and I'm not sure what it is now. But they accepted me, so I was going to go to Ecuador, of all places.
Wow.
And we came down to the valley to go to RGBI, Rio Grande Bible Institute, because my wife needed to learn Spanish. I already knew Spanish, and so I was good to go. But so she started taking the Spanish courses at RGBI, and just absolutely was drowning, going down for the third time, trying to get through all these, Spanish courses. And at the same time, I just knew that first year we were here. And by the way, I was still working the ER that first year, thinking...
You mean here or...
Here. Yes, I kept working in the emergency room, just joined a team here for the first year. And I knew in my heart that I just didn't have what it would take to be a missionary in a foreign country. It wasn't anything I could work out, mentally or intellectually. And I knew just in my soul that my wife would have a hard time, going into a foreign mission when we were just barely trying to, raise a family. And they were 1 and 3, something like that, when we first got here.
That was 83, 84?
So 83 is when we got here, fall of 83. I just finished Dallas, the MABS there, and started working in the emergency room that fall. Yeah, here in the valley at our Rio Grande Regional Hospital.
3 years later is when I moved down here, and that's when we hooked up again.
4 years later, yeah. 83 to 87.
87, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and Robert De La Rosa, who was a teacher here at RGBI's, found out later when you apparently asked him if there was anybody that could help you start up a church, and he says, "Well, there's this guy Jim Reitman, and he's a real piece of work, but he needs a lot of work. But yeah, he's smart, he can speak Spanish, so you might try him."
That's right. Oh my! Well, Robert De La Rosa married Nancy and I. He's the one that married us. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because we were together in Dallas Seminary. In fact, he had already finished all his courses, but he waited till I would finish so we would graduate together.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
Yeah. So he moved down here, and then I moved down here, and that's how.
I didn't know that part.
Yeah. So anyway, that's how we got hooked up. I called you and we met, I guess, at one time, and we started working together.
Yeah, I mean, back then it was the trailer in the back of Trini's home. Yeah.
Yeah, that was like several months later after we had started.
It was.
Yeah, and it was quite an adventure. Like we moved to different places until we finally settled down here. But that was something else. So all that time, that's when you had mentioned there was a transformation that had happened, and you had mentioned that I was a part of that. But the Lord was already working with you.
Yeah, He was.
You'd come into big realizations about your own life, and I remember you turned 40 when I was here, and
they had a party with the black balloons over the hill T-shirt. Yeah. I mean, I'm 72 now. That is a long time ago.
That's right.
So I realized, there was a transition there. And yet the performance thing was still very, very, very substantial within my soul at the time. I remember thinking to myself how much you used to weep and cry, you know. And I was saying, Reuben, get a grip. I mean, it's not that hard to figure out what to preach, and you don't have to cry, you know, just because. And I knew at the time, in fact, Reuben had put out his shingle as a counselor, pastoral counselor, and I let him use one of my exam rooms in my office here at Rio Grande Regional, there in the office complex behind the hospital, and I remember, and I've reminded Reuben of this. My relationship with my mother was always very problematic, and in retrospect, I think she may well have had a personality disorder. But by the way, just as part of that whole family nexus, my brother committed suicide right after he graduated from college at the age of 21, I think. I was 23 at the time in medical school. And that really touched me. So I was just sobbing on the phone when I found out from my mother, as a matter of fact, told me that he had committed suicide. And was strangely detached. And she said, why would he go do a thing like that? When you find out that your second son has killed himself and you ask the question, why would he go do that? There's something weird about that. A mother and her own child.
Right.
So,
which speaks of the detachment really with all the children.
Yeah.
If she was that with him, then...
Well, she wanted to own us. I can tell you that.
Own you? What do you mean?
Own our souls.
Oh.
Yeah. She, I can't speak of the other three kids in much detail. My youngest sib, my sister, went through some terrible emancipation issues just to get away from the ownership thing that she was putting on her.
Wanted to possess the soul.
Yeah, my thing was just to get as far away as I could, and so the need for self-protection from that invasion, the body snatcher kind of thing. That movie kind of speaks pretty graphically to the sense that I had of she was wanting to snatch, me for her own soul. And I had told you that when we were talking about my growth and development and where I was in life. And so one day, Reuben asked me if I had a minute to talk, and I thought, oh, he just wants to get my advice or, my expertise, and so I was flattered. But Reuben was wise as a serpent, innocent as a dove. He was doing his serpent thing with me, and I had a detachment thing going on with my own son at the time. And Reuben had seen this firsthand when we went out to play tennis one day. And I wanted to play tennis, and I wanted to be a force to be reckoned with Reuben. I didn't want to just, paddle the ball across the net to my son and have him bounce it back, maybe if he's lucky, and waste a lot of time where I could be competing with my, professional peer here. And I'm thinking, I guess, how clueless a father can you be as I look back on it? But Reuben saw it, and he knew what was going on. And so he asked me what was going on there. And so I fumbled around trying to come up with some sort of intellectual explanation. And he looked at me with this just laser kind of gray eye stare, like, I'm not going to buy into your, appeal to me to kind of cut you some slack. I'm not going to cut you any slack at all. That's the way I felt anyway. His eyes were just laser-like coming back. And Reuben said, I think that you are not, you don't want to attach to your son because of your relationship with your mother. And my face must have just looked like daggers were coming out of my eyes.
I remember that.
And he waited 10 seconds, and it seemed like an eternity, and that laser stare did not change. And he said, you want to kill me right now, don't you? And he was right. He got me. He did the diagnosis, and there was no treatment. That was the problem. I just needed more Jesus, and it came decades. It took decades for that to develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if I remember correctly, because I knew there was a lot there, so much, and you had tried this and this and this, and I had tried this, and that's when the thought came to my mind about you need to write. You need to write. And I remember suggesting that to you, and I didn't know how that was going to go, but you thought, well, yeah, that's...
Yes,
because you had, and I didn't
gift,
know.
You didn't know my gift from...
I didn't know that.
Exactly.
I didn't know that.
The creative writing and the expository writing. Yeah. If I didn't fool myself into a logic that made sense and that kept me okay without having to essentially give up my life, is what I ended up having to do.
Yes.
And that's been a long, decades-long process of gradually having my life ripped out of my hand before God could put the life into my hand that he wanted. I had to receive it, just like I had to receive the Lord. I mean, I had to receive the life that he wanted for me. But that took is taking the rest of my life.
Yeah, yeah. I remember, as I went through your writings on Job and Ecclesiastes, and to me, I mean, people that I've told you, like, man, that's hard to read. And, it is, but for me, the end where you share your own struggle, that's so like, I wish people could read that, because that's Jim.
Yeah.
And so it's so, I don't know what the word, attractive, inspiring, moving, that over the years, that, like you say, it took years and years. And in many ways, we're all still working on it, right? I mean, whatever we're stumbling with or have a problem with, but that has been a development for you. And that ushered into, that spilled over into your work in the Bible.
Take heart, my friend, we'll go together this uncertain road that lies ahead. Our faithful